She is chosen. She's ready to ascend.
I was standing in the shadows beneath that hidden altar when Julia, my own daughter-in-law, spoke those words. Her voice shook with something I'd never heard before. Devotion, maybe, or madness. The cult leader reached for my granddaughter with hands that had no right to touch her. The chamber stank of incense and rot. My heart was a stone in my chest, cold and heavy. But here's what they didn't know. I wasn't there to beg. I wasn't there to cry. I had come prepared to destroy them from the inside out. And let me tell you something. When a woman my age decides she's had enough, when she's spent a lifetime learning how people break and how systems fail, well, they never see it coming. Those arrogant fools thought they held all the cards. They had no idea I'd already planted the detonator, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where the crack first appeared. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning in late September. I remember because the air smelled like cedar and wet earth, the way it always does in Snoqualmie when autumn begins to bite. Grace and I were walking along the trail near Mirror Lake. She was 8 years old then, all knobby knees and wild curls bouncing with each step. She kept stopping to examine moss on tree trunks, asking me questions I didn't always know how to answer. "Grandma, why does moss only grow on one side?" I smiled and told her it had something to do with sunlight, or maybe water. Honestly, I couldn't remember. But that's not what mattered. What mattered was the weight of her small hand in mine, the sound of her laughter echoing through the trees, the absolute certainty that nothing in this world could hurt her as long as I was there. Retirement had been kind to me. After 40 years of nursing, of holding the hands of dying strangers, of wiping tears and cleaning wounds and pretending I had all the answers, I'd finally earned a little peace. Henry and I had settled into a rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks, quiet dinners where we didn't need to fill every silence with words. We'd earned this. Grace was the bonus, the unexpected gift. But something had changed in Julia. My daughter-in-law had always been a bit fragile, a bit uncertain. She'd married my son when she was young, and I'd watched her struggle to find her footing. She wanted so badly to be good, to be seen, to matter. It made her vulnerable in ways she didn't understand. About 3 months before that Tuesday morning, she'd started disappearing at night. At first, it was just once or twice a week. She'd tell my son she was attending a meditation group. Then it became 3 times a week, then nearly every night. When she came home, her eyes had this faraway look, like she'd left part of herself somewhere else. She stopped meeting my gaze during dinner. She stopped asking Grace about school. I told myself it was stress, new motherhood catching up to her even though Grace was 8. People process things at different speeds. I'd seen it 1,000 times in the hospital. Delayed grief, delayed anxiety, delayed everything. But then I started hearing the words. She'd be in the kitchen, murmuring to herself while washing dishes, her voice soft and rhythmic, like a prayer. The ascended ones, the pure vessel, the chosen path. I'd walk in and she'd startle, smile too quickly, change the subject. Once I caught her staring at Grace with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't quite love. It wasn't quite fear. It was something else entirely, something hungry. The real moment, the one that made my blood go cold, happened on a Thursday evening. I'd stopped by their house to drop off a casserole. Julia didn't know I was there. I'd let myself in through the side door the way I always did. And I heard her voice coming from Grace's bedroom, low and urgent. "She is chosen," Julia whispered. "She has ascended already in spirit, soon in body." I froze in the hallway. My hand was still on the casserole dish, but I couldn't feel it anymore. Everything had gone numb except for the pounding in my ears. Grace's small voice replied, confused and sleepy. "Mama, I don't understand." "You will, sweetheart, you will." I wanted to burst in. I wanted to scream. But something stopped me. Some instinct honed over decades of crisis management told me to stay quiet, to watch, to wait. You don't rush into a room when you don't understand what's happening. You assess first. So I backed out of the house, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I drove home in a daze. Henry was in his study when I walked in. He took one look at my face and stood up. "What happened?" I told him. Every word, every terrible, crawling suspicion. He listened the way he always did, steady, calm, his military training never quite leaving his bones. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "There's something wrong with Julia," I said. My voice cracked. "Something very wrong." Henry nodded slowly. "We need to be careful. If she's involved in something, I don't care what she's involved in." The words came out sharp, almost vicious. "I care about Grace." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift across the plaster. Grace's face kept floating through my mind. Her laugh, her questions about moss and sunlight, the way she held my hand like it was the only anchor in the world. I thought about Julia's eyes, that faraway look, that hunger, and I thought about the word she'd used, ascended. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew, with a bone-deep certainty that made my stomach twist, that I was running out of time. The crack had appeared, and cracks, left alone, only ever widen. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was going to find out what Julia had gotten herself into. I was going to find out who these people were, what they wanted, and how far they were willing to go. And if they tried to take my granddaughter from me, well, they'd learn what happens when you threaten a woman who's spent her whole life saving people. Sometimes, the only way to save someone is to become the thing others fear most. I spent the next 3 days watching Julia like a hawk. Not obviously. I've learned over the years that the best surveillance doesn't feel like surveillance at all. I dropped by with groceries, called to chat about nothing, offered to take Grace to the park. Normal grandmother things. Things that wouldn't raise suspicion. But I was cataloging everything. The way Julia's hands trembled when she answered the door. The stack of pamphlets I glimpsed on her kitchen counter before she swept them into a drawer. The new silver pendant around her neck, some kind of geometric symbol I didn't recognize. And the phone calls. So many hushed phone calls, always ending abruptly when someone entered the room. Henry helped me piece it together. He still had contacts from his military days, people who owed him favors. He made some calls, asked careful questions about unusual groups operating in the area. What he learned made my skin crawl. There were rumors, whispers about a spiritual community that had established itself deep in the woods beyond the hiking trails. Nothing official, nothing you'd find in any public records. But people talked. A few families had lost members to it over the years, young people mostly, vulnerable people searching for meaning, people like Julia. On the 4th day, everything shattered. It was a Monday morning. I remember because Monday had always been my day with Grace. We'd bake cookies together while Julia ran errands. I arrived at their house at 9:30 carrying my bag of baking supplies. The front door was unlocked. That should have been my first warning. The house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. Too quiet, too still, like the air itself was holding its breath. "Julia," I called out. My voice echoed through empty rooms. Nothing. Grace? Still nothing. I moved through the house, my heart starting to pound. Grace's bedroom was neat, almost unnaturally so. Her bed was made with hospital corners. Her stuffed animals were lined up on the shelf in perfect rows. Grace never made her bed like that. She was 8 years old. Her room was usually a beautiful disaster of books and toys and half-finished art projects. This wasn't right. I checked every room, the bathroom, the basement, the backyard. With each empty space, the panic climbed higher in my chest. Finally, I returned to the kitchen and saw it. A single sheet of paper on the counter, held down by a coffee mug. My hands shook as I picked it up. The handwriting was Julia's, but neater than usual, careful, deliberate. like she'd written it multiple times until she got it exactly right. It is time for her ascension. Don't look for us. This is her purpose. This is her gift to the world. You wouldn't understand, Eleanor. You've always been too focused on the physical realm. Grace is meant for something higher. I read it 3 times. 4. The words didn't change. They stayed there, black ink on white paper, destroying everything. My knees buckled. I grabbed the counter to keep from falling. The kitchen tilted around me, walls closing in. For a moment, just one terrible moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but feel the enormous weight of what I'd just lost. Grace was gone. My granddaughter, my sweet, curious, beautiful Grace, gone. And Julia had taken her. I don't know how long I stood there. Time had become meaningless, but eventually, something shifted inside me. The panic didn't disappear. It transformed, hardened, became something else entirely. I was a nurse for 40 years. I'd worked in emergency rooms where seconds meant the difference between life and death. I'd held pressure on wounds while doctors operated. I'd talked down suicidal patients at 3 a.m. I'd watched people die, and I'd watched people fight their way back from the edge. I knew how to function in crisis. And this was a crisis. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called Henry. My voice was steady when he answered, steadier than I felt. "They took her," I said simply. "Julia left a note. They have Grace." Henry swore softly. Then, in that calm military tone he used when things got serious, he asked, "What do you need me to do?" "Meet me at home. Bring everything you have from your old files. Maps, notes, anything about structures in the woods. We're going to find her." "Eleanor." "We're going to find her," I repeated, harder this time. "And we're going to bring her home." I hung up before he could argue, before he could tell me to call the police, to wait, to be reasonable. There wasn't time for reasonable. Julia had at least a 6-hour head start, maybe more. Every minute I wasted was a minute Grace spent with those people. I looked down at the note again. The words blurred through tears I hadn't realized were falling. "You wouldn't understand, Eleanor." Oh, but I did understand. I understood perfectly. Julia had been swallowed by something dark and hungry, and now she was trying to feed them my granddaughter. She thought this was love. She thought this was salvation. She had no idea what she'd actually done. She'd awakened something in me I'd kept carefully controlled for decades. The part of me that didn't negotiate, didn't compromise. The part that had made life or death decisions in hospital rooms at 2 a.m. and lived with the consequences. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my pocket. Evidence, if I needed it later. Then I walked through the house one more time, memorizing every detail. Grace's hairbrush on the bathroom sink, her sneakers by the front door, the drawing she'd taped to the refrigerator, a picture of the 2 of us holding hands under a rainbow. I touched the drawing gently. My finger traced the crayon lines. "I'm coming for you," I whispered to the empty house. "They don't get to keep you." Outside, the morning sun was bright and cheerful, completely indifferent to the nightmare unfolding. Birds sang in the trees. A neighbor waved as he checked his mailbox. Normal life continuing while mine split apart. I got in my car and drove home, my mind already racing ahead. I needed to see Henry's old files, needed to understand the layout of those woods, the possible locations where a group could hide. Needed to find someone, anyone, who knew about this cult from the inside. Because here's what Julia didn't understand about me. I'd spent my entire career learning how bodies work, how systems function, how to find the weak points in any structure, how to keep people alive when everything was trying to kill them. Now I was going to use everything I'd learned to tear apart whatever had taken my family. They'd given me a note that said, "Don't look for us." They should have known better. I was already hunting. Henry was waiting for me when I got home. He'd already pulled out the boxes from his study, 3 cardboard containers stacked on the dining room table, their sides marked with faded labels in his blocky handwriting. Snoqualmie region. 1987 to 1992. Structural surveys. Classified. Expired. He looked up when I walked in. His face was gray, older than I'd seen it in years. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. So I did. I handed him Julia's note and watched his jaw tighten as he read it. When he finished, he set it down carefully like it might explode. Then he opened the first box. "I mapped most of the remote structures in this area back when I was with intelligence," he explained, his voice steady but strained. "Military wanted to know every building, every access point, every potential security concern within a 50-mile radius. Most of it was nothing. Abandoned logging camps, old ranger stations, that sort of thing." He pulled out a stack of yellowed survey maps and spread them across the table. The paper smelled like dust and old ink, like history. Each map was covered in Henry's meticulous notes, coordinates, dates, structural assessments, written in tiny, precise letters. "But there was one place," he continued, tapping a map near the top of the pile. "Right here. We found it in 1989. I leaned closer. The map showed a section of forest about 15 miles northeast of town, well beyond the popular hiking trails. Henry had marked several structures in red ink, small rectangles representing buildings, and there, in the upper corner, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it, was a tiny red dot with a notation beside it. "Secondary access. Unverified," I read aloud. Henry nodded grimly. "We documented the main compound buildings, 6 structures, all connected by covered walkways. But one of the junior surveyors noticed something odd about the terrain. There was a depression in the hillside that didn't match the natural topography, like something had been carved out and then concealed." My heart was pounding now. An entrance. Maybe. We never confirmed it. The property owner was, let's say, uncooperative, claimed religious sanctuary, threatened lawsuits. My superiors decided it wasn't worth the political headache. We noted it in the files and moved on. I stared at that tiny red dot. Such a small mark. So easy to overlook. But now it felt enormous, like it was burning a hole through the paper. "That's where they are," I said. It wasn't a question. Henry met my eyes. "I think so." I pulled the map closer, studying every detail. The main compound sat in a natural bowl surrounded by dense forest. Only one road led in, heavily gated according to Henry's notes. But that secondary entrance, if it existed, would be their blind spot. A way in they might not be watching. "Show me the rest," I demanded, spreading my hands across the table. "Everything you have on this place." For the next 2 hours, Henry and I went through every document in those boxes: survey reports, aerial photographs taken from military helicopters, structural assessments, notes about power lines, water sources, access roads. I absorbed it all, building a map in my mind. The compound had been constructed sometime in the early 1980s, probably by a wealthy landowner. The main building was substantial, over 5,000 square feet, with several smaller outbuildings, solar panels on one roof, a well system, generator backup. They were designed to be self-sufficient, isolated, perfect for people who didn't want outside interference. Henry found a memo he'd written in 1990, filed away in the bottom of the second box. His handwriting was younger then, more confident. The memo detailed a brief encounter with some of the compound's residents. They'd called themselves a spiritual retreat center, claimed to offer meditation and enlightenment services. Nothing illegal, nothing that warranted further investigation. But at the bottom of the memo, Henry had added a personal note. "Something feels wrong here." Residents appeared coached, fear in their eyes despite smiles. "Recommend continued monitoring." I touched the faded ink gently. "You saw it," I whispered. "Even back then, you knew." Henry's voice was rough when he answered. I should have pushed harder, should have made them investigate properly. "You couldn't have known." But even as I said it, I wondered, how many others had sensed something wrong over the years? How many had chosen to look away? I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything, Every map, every note, every detail that might matter. Then I sat back and tried to think like they would. If I were running a cult that wanted to stay hidden, how would I operate? What would my vulnerabilities be? The answer came quickly. Information. They'd want to control information. Anyone who left would be a threat. Anyone who knew too much would need to be silenced or discredited, which meant there had to be others, former members, people who'd escaped or been cast out, people who might help me if I could find them. I need to talk to someone who's been inside, I said, thinking aloud, someone who knows the layout, the routines, the security. Henry frowned. That's a tall order. These groups don't exactly advertise their former members. No, but desperate people leave traces. I'd seen it in the hospital. Abuse victims who came to emergency rooms with carefully constructed lies. Addicts who checked themselves in and then vanished before treatment finished. People running from something always left breadcrumbs, even when they tried not to. I grabbed my laptop and started searching. Local news archives, missing person reports, online forums about cults and spiritual abuse. It took an hour of digging, but finally I found something. A blog post from 3 years ago. The post was brief, almost cryptic. Someone using the screen name CastOut87 had written about escaping a spiritual community in the Pacific Northwest. They mentioned Snoqualmie by name, said they were lucky to get out alive. The post had been deleted, but I found a cached version still floating in the digital archives. At the bottom was an email address, probably defunct by now, but worth trying. I composed a message, keeping it simple and direct. I need help finding someone taken by the group near Snoqualmie, my 8-year-old granddaughter. Please, if you know anything, contact me. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Henry was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pride, maybe, or worry, probably both. "What's your plan?" he asked carefully. I looked down at the map spread across our dining room table, at the tiny red dot that might be Grace's salvation, at decades of Henry's careful documentation that had been sitting in boxes all this time, waiting for this exact moment. "I'm going to find that entrance," I said firmly. "I'm going to get inside and I'm going to bring her home. Eleanor, I know it's dangerous. I know it's probably insane. But Henry, she's in there. Our granddaughter is in there with people who think she's some kind of..." I couldn't finish. The words stuck in my throat. He reached across the table and took my hand. His skin was warm, familiar, steady. "Then we do this smart," he said quietly. "We plan, we prepare, we don't rush in blind." I nodded, squeezing his fingers. "Smart," I agreed, "but fast." My laptop chimed. I grabbed it, heart jumping. An email, new message, from CastOut87. My hands trembled as I opened it. The message was short, just 3 lines. "I know the place you're talking about. I know what they do there. Meet me tomorrow, 6 p.m. at the coffee shop on Cedar Street. Come alone, and be ready for the truth. It's worse than you think." I read it twice, then looked up at Henry. "I found someone," I said softly. "Someone who got out." And for the first time since finding Julia's note that morning, I felt something besides despair. I felt hope. Dangerous, fragile hope. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grace's face, heard Julia's whispered words about ascension, felt the weight of that tiny red dot on Henry's map, burning like a brand in my mind. By 5 the next morning, I was already dressed and drinking coffee at the kitchen table. Henry found me there, surrounded by printed copies of every document we'd found. I'd highlighted key details in yellow, made notes in the margins, built a timeline of the compound's history. "You look terrible," he said gently, pouring himself a cup. "I feel terrible." I rubbed my eyes. They felt like sandpaper. "But I can't stop. Every minute I waste is another minute she's in there." He sat down across from me and reached for my hand. We didn't say anything for a while, just sat there in the pre-dawn darkness, holding on to each other. After 43 years of marriage, sometimes silence says more than words ever could. The coffee shop on Cedar Street was a small place, tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner. I arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a corner table where I could watch the door, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea I had no intention of drinking. The warmth was comforting, though. Grounding. At exactly 6 o'clock, a man walked in. He was younger than I expected. Late 30s, maybe early 40s, lean in a way that suggested he'd lost weight recently, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, but it was his eyes that caught me. They were haunted, wary, the eyes of someone who'd seen things they couldn't unsee. He scanned the room, and when his gaze landed on me, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or calculation. He walked over slowly, like approaching a skittish animal. "Eleanor?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. I nodded. "Cast out 87, I presume." A bitter smile crossed his lips. "Mason. My real name's Mason." He slid into the chair across from me, his movements tense and controlled. "You said something about your granddaughter. Grace. She's 8 years old. My daughter-in-law took her to that compound 3 days ago." I kept my voice steady, factual. "I need to get her out." Mason's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring at something I couldn't see. When he spoke again, his words were careful, measured. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said quietly. "Calden, the man who runs that place, he's not just some charlatan preacher. He's a predator. He knows exactly how to break people down, how to make them believe they're nothing without him." "How long were you there?" 4 years. The words came out flat, emotionless. "I went in looking for meaning after my wife left me. Thought I'd found a community, a purpose. By the time I realized what it really was, I was in too deep." I leaned forward. "What made you leave?" His eyes met mine then, and I saw raw pain in them. Calden decided I was too independent, too questioning. He couldn't tolerate anyone who might challenge his authority. Mason's hands clenched on the table. He orchestrated my expulsion in front of everyone, made them all turn against me, told them I was spiritually contaminated. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "Don't be sorry yet." His voice turned hard. "You asked what they do there. You need to understand. Calden's obsessed with this idea of pure vessels. Young people, usually children, who he claims can channel divine energy. He grooms the parents first, makes them believe their kids are special, chosen." My stomach turned to ice. "Grace. If he's targeted your granddaughter, then yes. He'll have convinced your daughter-in-law that offering grace to the community is the highest form of love." Mason's expression was grim. "The rituals start small, meditation sessions, fasting, but they escalate. And once a child is marked as a vessel..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "What happens?" I needed to hear it, even though every instinct screamed at me to cover my ears. "I don't know exactly. They never let me into the inner sanctum where the final ceremonies happen. But I heard things. Saw people afterward." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Whatever they do in there, it breaks them, changes them. Some never recover." The tea mug shook in my hands. I set it down carefully before I dropped it. "I need to get inside," I said firmly. "I have maps. I know about the secondary entrance, but I need someone who knows the layout, the routines, the security protocols." Mason stared at me like I'd suggested flying to the moon. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack." "You're what? 65? 70? 68. And I spent 40 years keeping people alive in emergency rooms." I met his incredulous gaze without flinching. "I know how to function under pressure. I know how to improvise. And I know I'm not leaving my granddaughter in that place." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of shared desperation. Even if you get inside, he said slowly, even if you find her, how do you plan to get out? There are cameras, guards, people who'll die for Calden if he asks them to. Then I guess I'll have to be smarter than they are. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos of Henry's maps. This is the compound, right? And this mark here, is that the entrance you know about? Mason leaned closer, studying the images. His finger traced the red dot Henry had marked decades ago. I'll be damned, he breathed. I thought I was the only one who knew about that passage. You've used it. Once. When they kicked me out, I snuck back in to grab some personal belongings they'd confiscated. Took me weeks to find the entrance. It's hidden behind a false rock formation on the north hillside. He looked up at me, and I saw something new in his eyes. Fire. It's still there, still unguarded. Calden doesn't even know it exists. My heart was racing now. Will you show me? Why would I help you? But there was no real challenge in his question, just cautious curiosity. Because you want revenge, I said bluntly. You want to hurt the man who broke you, who humiliated you, who threw you away. And because you're decent enough that you can't stand the thought of what they'll do to an 8-year-old girl. Mason was quiet for a long moment. His hands were still clenched on the table, knuckles white. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. I want more than revenge, he admitted. I want to destroy him. Everything he's built, everything he represents. He looked at me directly. But I won't risk your granddaughter's life for my vendetta. If we do this, we do it smart, careful, no heroics. Agreed. I extended my hand across the table. Partners? He hesitated, then took my hand. His grip was firm, almost painfully tight. Partners. We spent the next hour going over details. Mason sketched the interior layout from memory, marking guard stations and camera placements. He explained the daily routines, the ceremony schedules, the best times to move unseen. I took notes, asked questions, built a plan. By the time we left that coffee shop, the sun had set completely. The street was dark, lit only by scattered street lamps. Mason walked me to my car, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Tomorrow night, I said. We scout the entrance, make sure it's still viable. He nodded. Midnight. I'll meet you at the trailhead off Route 202. I started to get in my car, then paused. Mason? Why did you really agree to help me? His expression was unreadable in the darkness. Because when I left that place, I swore if I ever got the chance to stop them, I would. You're giving me that chance. He stepped back. Don't be late tomorrow. I drove home through empty streets, my mind spinning with plans and contingencies. When I walked through the door, Henry was waiting. Well, he asked. We have a way in, I said simply, and we have help. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling once more, a new worry gnawed at me. Mason wanted revenge. That made him useful. But it also made him unpredictable. Dangerous. Could I trust him? Could I afford not to? And more importantly, what would I do if his need for vengeance put Grace in even greater danger? The next night, I met Mason at the trailhead as planned. Midnight had turned the forest into something alien and hostile. The darkness felt thick, almost physical. I'd worn black clothing, carried a small flashlight, and told Henry exactly where I'd be, just in case. Mason emerged from the shadows like he'd been part of them. He nodded once, then started walking without a word. I followed, my feet finding purchase on the uneven ground despite the darkness. Years of night shifts had taught me how to navigate without much light. The hidden entrance was exactly where he'd described, behind a formation of moss-covered rocks on the north hillside. You'd never find it unless you knew to look. Mason showed me the gap between two boulders, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. This leads to a maintenance tunnel, he whispered, his breath fogging in the cold air. Comes out near the old generator room. From there you can access most of the compound. I memorized every detail, the angle of the rocks, the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves, the way the entrance was obscured by overhanging branches. We didn't go inside that night. Too risky, but I'd seen enough. 2 days, I told Mason as we made our way back. I need 2 days to prepare. Then we go in. He agreed and we parted ways in the parking lot. I drove home with my mind already racing through contingencies, backup plans, ways things could go wrong and how to prevent them, but I never got those 2 days. The next morning, my phone rang at 7, an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Something made me pick up anyway. Eleanor. Julia's voice, but wrong somehow, too bright, too cheerful, like she was performing happiness for an invisible audience. My hand tightened on the phone. Where is she? Where's Grace? She's perfect. She's exactly where she needs to be. Julia spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other. Eleanor, you need to stop looking for us. This is what's best for her, for all of us. Calden has shown me the truth. Grace has a gift, a purpose. We're helping her fulfill her destiny. Julia, listen to me. No, you listen. Her voice turned sharp suddenly, cutting through the false cheer. You've never understood me, never seen me. You've always thought I was weak, unstable, not good enough for your son. But Calden sees me. He values me. And Grace will transcend everything you could never be. The words hit like physical blows. I never thought you were weak. Don't lie. She was shouting now, raw and ragged. I saw it in your eyes every time you looked at me. Pity. Disappointment. Well, I don't need your approval anymore. I have a real family now. People who understand what truly matters. Grace needs her grandmother, I said desperately, abandoning pride, abandoning pretense. She needs normalcy, safety. She needs to ascend. Julia screamed it, then suddenly went silent. When she spoke again, her voice was eerily calm. Come to the compound tonight, Eleanor. Come see for yourself what we're building, what Grace is becoming. Maybe then you'll understand. The line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, Julia's words echoing in my skull. She'd actually invited me to walk into that place. It was obviously a trap, had to be, but it was also an opportunity. I called Mason immediately, told him about Julia's call. He was quiet for a long moment before responding, his voice tight with controlled anger. It's Calden. He's using her to lure you in. Probably wants to neutralize the threat you represent. I know. I was already pulling out my notes, adjusting my plans, but it also means they're worried. We've rattled them somehow. Eleanor, you can't actually be considering... I'm going tonight. My voice was flat, final. With or without you. He cursed under his breath. Then we do it my way. We go in together, but we stay smart. First sign of trouble, we abort. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Henry helped me pack. A small backpack with water, a first aid kit, my phone fully charged. He kept his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I should come with you, he said for the third time. No. I cupped his face in my hands. I need you here. If something goes wrong, if I don't come back by dawn, you call everyone. Police, FBI, media. You burn that place to the ground with exposure. His jaw worked. Eleanor. I love you. I kissed him gently. 43 years, and I'd do it all again. Don't talk like that, he said roughly. You're coming home with Grace. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. Mason and I approached the compound just after 9, but instead of using the hidden entrance, we walked straight up to the main gate. The guard, a young man in his 20s, looked startled to see us. Eleanor Richardson, I announced calmly. Julia invited me. I'm here to see my granddaughter. The guard radioed someone, spoke in low tones, then opened the gate. Just like that, we were inside. The compound looked almost peaceful in the evening light. Clean pathways, well-maintained buildings, soft music drifting from somewhere. If you didn't know better, you'd think it was a wellness retreat. But I knew better, and the wrongness of it all made my skin crawl. A woman approached us, middle-aged, wearing flowing white robes, her smile fixed and glassy. "Welcome. Julia is waiting for you in the temple. Please follow me." As we walked deeper into the compound, I noticed people watching us from doorways and windows. Their expressions were eerily similar: blank, peaceful, empty, like someone had scooped out everything that made them human and replaced it with programmed serenity. Mason's hand brushed my elbow briefly. A warning. I understood. Stay alert, stay ready. The temple was the largest building, positioned at the center of everything. The woman in white opened massive wooden doors and warm lights spilled out. Inside, rows of cushions faced a raised platform, and on that platform stood Julia. She looked different. Her hair was longer, loosely braided. She wore white robes identical to the other woman's, but it was her face that shocked me. She looked radiant, transformed, like she'd found something she'd been searching for her entire life. Eleanor. She spoke my name like a blessing. "You came. Where's Grace?" I kept my voice steady, neutral. "She's preparing for tonight's ceremony. You'll see her soon." Julia descended from the platform gracefully, her movements practiced. "First, I need you to understand what we're doing here, what Calden has taught us." "I understand plenty," I said coldly. "I understand you've kidnapped my granddaughter." "Liberated," Julia corrected sharply. "We've liberated her from the prison of ordinary existence. Eleanor, don't you see? Grace is special. She can bridge the physical and spiritual realms. Under Calden's guidance, she'll achieve things you can't even imagine." "She's 8 years old." "Exactly." Julia's eyes were fevered now, pupils dilated. Pure, uncorrupted by doubt or fear. The perfect vessel. Behind me, I heard Mason shift his weight, felt the tension radiating from him. We were surrounded. The doors had closed. People were filing into the temple, taking seats on the cushions, all wearing white, all watching us with those empty, serene expressions. And then he entered. Calden. I'd expected someone imposing, physically intimidating, but he was ordinary, average height, average build, maybe 50 years old, handsome in a bland, forgettable way, until you looked at his eyes. They were sharp, calculating, predatory. He smiled at me like we were old friends. "Eleanor," he said warmly, spreading his arms in welcome. "Finally, Julia has told me so much about you. Where's my granddaughter?" Direct. I appreciate that. His smile widened. Grace is being prepared for her awakening. Tonight she'll take her first steps toward transcendence. And you, Eleanor, you're going to witness it. "Like hell I am." His expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in those cold eyes. Amusement, like I'd said exactly what he'd expected. "You don't have a choice," he said gently. "You're here now, in our sanctuary, under our protection." He paused, letting the words sink in. Or perhaps I should say, under our control. The doors behind us locked with a solid, final click, and Julia, my daughter-in-law, stood beside Calden and smiled at me with absolute devotion. "It's time you understood, Eleanor," she said softly. "Grace isn't yours anymore. She never was. She belongs to something greater now." I looked at her, at this woman I'd known for 15 years, who'd married my son, who'd given birth to my granddaughter, and I realized with sickening clarity that I'd never really known her at all. She wasn't a victim. She was a true believer. And that made her more dangerous than Calden himself. They separated us immediately. 2 men in white robes, young, strong, with that same blank serenity in their eyes, took Mason by the arms. He tensed, and I knew he was calculating whether to fight. I caught his gaze and shook my head slightly. Not yet. Not while we didn't know where Grace was. He let them lead him away without resistance. Smart. But the look he threw back at me was pure fury, directed not at me but at himself. He'd walked us into a trap, and he knew it. "Eleanor." Calden's voice was silk over steel. Please sit. We have much to discuss before the ceremony begins." "I'm not here to discuss anything. I want my granddaughter, now." He tilted his head, studying me with those predator eyes. "You know, Julia warned me you'd be difficult. Strong-willed," she said. "Stubborn. Trapped in old ways of thinking." He gestured to a cushion near the platform. "But I see something else. I see a woman who's terrified she's losing her family, and that fear makes you dangerous." "You're damn right it does. Please, sit." It wasn't a request this time. I sat. Not because he commanded it, but because I needed to stall, needed time to think, to plan, to find a way out of this. The temple had filled with maybe 40 people, all positioned around us in a loose circle, watching, waiting. Julia stood beside Calden on the platform, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The gesture was intimate, possessive, and suddenly I understood something that made my stomach turn. This wasn't just about Grace. This was about Julia finding validation, worth, identity, all the things she'd never found in our family. Calden had given her something we hadn't, or maybe something she'd never let us give her, and now she'd sacrifice anything to keep it, including her own daughter. "Let me tell you a story," Calden began, his voice carrying easily through the space. 20 years ago, I was lost, broken, searching for meaning in a meaningless world. Then I had a vision. I saw that certain souls, rare, precious souls, could serve as bridges between our reality and higher planes of existence. He was performing now, speaking to the entire room, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. "Children," he continued, "especially those untainted by skepticism, make the purest vessels. Through careful guidance, through ritual and devotion, they can achieve what others only dream of: transcendence, enlightenment, ascension." "You mean exploitation?" I said flatly. "You mean brainwashing children and calling it spiritual?" A ripple went through the crowd. Whispers, shifting bodies. Julia's face hardened, but Calden just smiled wider. "You see? This is exactly the resistance we face from the unenlightened. Eleanor, your granddaughter, came to us willingly. She's 8 years old. She can't consent to anything. She came with her mother's blessing. Julia understands what you refuse to see. Grace has a gift, a destiny. We're simply helping her fulfill it." I stood up abruptly. "Where is she?" Calden's smile finally faltered. Something cold flickered across his face. "You're testing my patience. And you're testing mine. I didn't come here for your sermon. I came for Grace." "Guards." His voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. 4 more men materialized from the shadows at the edge of the temple. They surrounded me, close enough that I could smell their sweat, see the absolute certainty in their eyes. They would die for him if he asked, would kill for him without hesitation. I was 68 years old, facing men half my age. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to back down, to wait, to find another way, but fear and fury had burned away rationality. "Grace," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Grace, if you can hear me." A hand clamped over my mouth. Another grabbed my arms, wrenching them behind my back. I struggled, but they were too strong. The room spun. I heard Julia say something, her voice sharp with irritation rather than concern. Heard Calden respond with that same silky calm. Then they were dragging me out of the temple, down a hallway that smelled like incense and mildew. My feet scraped against the floor. I tried to memorize the turns, the doorways, anything that might help me later, if there was a later. They threw me into a small room and locked the door. The darkness was absolute. I felt along the walls. Concrete blocks, cold and damp. No windows. The door was solid metal. I was trapped. I sank down to the floor, my back against the wall, and for the first time since finding Julia's note 5 days ago, I let myself break. Not sobbing, Not theatrical grief, just silent tears running down my face while I sat in the dark and faced the truth. I'd failed. I'd walked right into their trap. Thought I was so smart, so prepared, but they'd outmaneuvered me at every turn. And now Grace was somewhere in this compound, being prepared for God knows what, and I couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. Mason was probably in a similar cell. Henry was at home waiting for a call that wouldn't come. And Grace... I couldn't let myself think about Grace. Not yet. If I did, the despair would swallow me whole. Time passed. I don't know how much. Without windows or light, minutes felt like hours. I heard sounds occasionally. Footsteps in the hallway, muffled voices, once what might have been chanting from somewhere far away. Then, finally, a key in the lock. The door opened. Fluorescent light from the hallway blinded me. I squinted against it, raising my hand to shield my eyes. Someone stepped into the doorway, silhouetted against the brightness. "Get up." Julia's voice cold and flat. "It's time." I struggled to my feet, my legs stiff from sitting. "Julia, please listen to me." "I'm done listening to you." She stepped closer, and I could see her face now. The radiance from earlier was gone. She looked tired, brittle, like something had cracked in her too. "You've always underestimated me, Eleanor. Always thought I needed your protection, your guidance, your approval." "That's not true." It is!" Her voice broke suddenly, raw emotion flooding through. "You looked at me like I was broken, like I wasn't good enough for your son, like I'd never be the mother Grace deserved. Well, I'm proving you wrong. Tonight, Grace ascends, and you're going to watch." She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. I let her pull me from the cell. What choice did I have? But I was watching, cataloging, memorizing. The hallway turned left, then right. Third door on the left. Camera in the upper corner of the corridor junction. Guard station at the end. If I got another chance, I'd need every detail. Julia led me back to the temple. The room had transformed. Candles everywhere, hundreds of them, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The followers sat in perfect stillness, their faces beatific in the golden light. And at the center of it all, on that raised platform, stood an altar I hadn't noticed before. Calden was there, dressed now in elaborate robes. Beside him, 2 attendants in white, and between them, Grace. My breath stopped. She was so small up there, wearing a white dress that made her look like a ghost. Her hair had been brushed until it shone. Her face was blank, drugged maybe, or in shock. But she was alive. She was there. I tried to move toward her, but Julia's grip tightened. "Don't," she hissed. "You'll only make it worse. What are you going to do to her?" My voice was barely a whisper. "Help her transcend." Julia's eyes were fever bright again. "You'll see, Eleanor. You'll finally understand." They positioned me at the edge of the circle, close enough to see but too far to reach. Mason was there too, on the opposite side, held by 2 guards. Our eyes met across the candle-lit space. His expression was desperate, furious, calculating. He was planning something. I could see it. But what? What could either of us possibly do now? Calden raised his hands and the room fell silent. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, resonant, hypnotic. "We gather tonight to witness the awakening of a pure vessel. Grace has been chosen, prepared, perfected. Through this ceremony, she will shed the limitations of flesh and join with the divine essence that flows through all creation." The followers began to chant, a low, rhythmic sound that made my skin crawl. Grace swayed slightly on the platform, her eyes unfocused. What had they given her? What had they done? "The ritual requires sacrifice," Calden continued, picking up something from the altar, a blade. Ornate and old, the metal catching the candlelight. "Not of the body, but of the attachment that binds the vessel to this realm. The mother must offer her freely, must sever the earthly bond with her own hands." He turned to Julia and offered her the blade. She took it without hesitation. My entire body went cold. "Julia, no, you can't." "Silence her," Calden commanded. A hand clamped over my mouth again. I struggled, but it was useless. I could only watch as Julia approached her daughter, the blade gleaming in her hand. Grace blinked slowly, her gaze focusing briefly on her mother. "Mama." Her voice was small, confused, heartbreakingly young. "I love you," Julia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This is how I show you. This is how I set you free." She raised the blade, and across the temple Mason moved. He twisted violently, slamming his elbow into one guard's throat. The man went down, choking. Mason grabbed the other guard's arm, using the momentum to flip him over his shoulder. It happened in seconds. Brutal, efficient, the violence of a man with nothing left to lose. He grabbed the fallen guard's radio and hurled it at the nearest cluster of candles. They toppled, flames catching on the white robes of a follower. Someone screamed. Panic erupted. In the chaos, Mason's eyes found mine. He mouthed 2 words, "Second altar." Then he charged toward the platform, toward Grace, toward Julia, and that raised blade. The guards released me to chase him. I ran too, shoving through panicked followers, knocking over candles, adding to the chaos. The temple was filling with smoke now. Fire was spreading faster than anyone expected, hungry and eager. Mason reached the platform first. He barreled into Calden, sending them both crashing to the ground. Julia turned, startled, the blade still in her hand. And Grace finally seemed to wake up, her eyes widening with terror as she saw the flames, the fighting, her mother armed and crying. "Grandma!" she screamed. I was almost there. Almost. My lungs burned from smoke and exertion. My vision blurred, but I could see her, could reach her. Then something hit me from behind, hard. I went down, my head cracking against the floor. The world spun. Through the haze of pain and smoke, I saw Julia grab Grace's arm, saw them disappear through a door behind the altar. The door slammed shut, locked. I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't respond. Someone was shouting my name. Mason, maybe, or Henry, or Grace. The sounds all blurred together. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was flames dancing across the ceiling, hungry and bright, consuming everything Calden had built. And Grace was gone. I woke to Mason's face hovering over mine, streaked with soot and blood. The temple was an inferno behind him, flames climbing the walls, smoke choking the air. He was shouting something, but the roar of fire drowned out his words. Then he grabbed me under the arms and hauled me up. My head exploded with pain. The world tilted sickeningly, but Mason kept me upright, half dragging me toward an exit I couldn't see through the smoke. We burst out into the night air. I collapsed on the grass, coughing until my ribs ached. Mason knelt beside me, his hands checking for injuries with surprising gentleness. When he was satisfied I wasn't dying, he sat back on his heels. "The second altar," he said urgently. "Henry's memo. You remember it?" Through the fog of pain and shock, memory flickered. Henry's note from 1990. "The second altar hides behind a false wall." I'd read it a dozen times while studying those files. "Behind the platform," I croaked. "There's another chamber." "That's where they took her. I saw Julia go through that door. It's the inner sanctum, where they do the real ceremonies, the ones even I wasn't allowed to see." His expression was grim. "Whatever they're planning for Grace, it's happening in there." I pushed myself up, ignoring the screaming protest from my head, my ribs, every part of my body that wanted to quit. Then we go in. The temple's on fire. I don't care if it's the mouth of hell. Grace is in there. Mason studied me for a moment, then nodded sharply. "The door locks from the inside. We'll need another way." That's when Henry's memo clicked fully into place. Not just the location of the second altar, but the architectural detail he'd noted. The ventilation system, old buildings like this, especially ones designed for secret chambers, always needed air circulation, and that meant ducts, access points. "The generator room," I said, my mind racing despite the pain. "Henry documented an HVAC system. If the second chamber connects to the main building's ventilation, we can use the maintenance shaft." Mason's eyes widened. "You're talking about crawling through air ducts while the building burns around us. You have a better idea?" He didn't. We circled around the compound, staying low, using the chaos to our advantage. People were fleeing the main temple, some trying to fight the fire with garden hoses, others simply running in panic. No one paid attention to two smoke-stained figures heading toward the utility building. The generator room was exactly where Henry's map said it would be. Mason kicked open the door, and we stumbled into a space filled with humming machinery and the smell of diesel fuel. There, on the far wall, a maintenance panel with a ventilation grate. Mason pried it open with his bare hands, the metal screeching in protest. Beyond was darkness and the whisper of moving air. "I'll go first," he said. "No." I grabbed his arm. "You're bigger. You might get stuck. I'm smaller. I go." He started to argue, saw the determination in my face, and surrendered. "If you get trapped in there, I won't." I didn't know if that was true, but I said it with absolute conviction. The shaft was tight, claustrophobic, and pitch black. I pulled myself forward on my elbows, inch by inch, my shoulders scraping the metal walls. The air was hot and stale, tasting of smoke and old dust. Behind me, I could hear Mason following, his breathing harsh in the confined space. Time lost meaning in that darkness. Every foot felt like a mile. My head throbbed, my lungs burned, but I kept moving, kept crawling toward Grace. Finally, light. A grate ahead, dim and flickering. I pressed my face against it and looked down into the chamber below. The second altar. It was smaller than the main temple, carved out of natural rock. The walls were covered in symbols I didn't recognize, spirals and geometric patterns that made my eyes hurt to look at them. Candles ringed the space, their flames dancing shadows across stone. And there, at the center, was Grace. She was lying on a stone platform, her white dress spread around her like wings. Still. Too still. My heart seized until I saw her chest rise and fall. Unconscious then, drugged again. Julia stood beside the platform, the ceremonial blade still in her hand. She was crying silently, her whole body shaking, but she didn't move to help her daughter. Didn't run, just stood there, trapped between two impossible choices. Calden was there too, kneeling before a wooden chest I recognized from Henry's photographs. The chest he'd noted as significant but contents unknown. Calden was pulling out documents, stacks of them, yellowed with age, papers covered in handwriting, photographs, what looked like official records. "The proof is all here," he was saying to Julia, his voice low and urgent. "Everything I've built, everything we've accomplished, the families who've donated their children, the ceremonies, the transformations, all documented, protected." "Destroy them," Julia whispered desperately. "Calden, please, the fire. We have to destroy them before anyone—" "No." His voice turned sharp. "These records are our legacy, our proof. When the world is ready to understand, these will vindicate everything we've done." I understood then. This wasn't just about Grace. This chamber was Calden's archive, his insurance policy, decades of crimes carefully documented, names, dates, evidence that could destroy him and everyone connected to him, evidence that could save Grace. I found the latch on the grate and pushed. It swung open with a metallic groan. Calden and Julia's heads snapped up as I dropped into the chamber, landing hard on stone. Pain shot through my ankles, but I ignored it. "Get away from her," I said, my voice deadly quiet. Calden rose smoothly, positioning himself between me and Grace. Eleanor, still fighting, still refusing to see. He smiled that bland, forgettable smile. "How did you— Henry's old maps. Clever. Tragic but clever. "Those documents," I said, pointing at the chest. "That's why you brought her here, not for some ritual. You needed a hostage, insurance in case everything fell apart." His smile widened. "You're smarter than Julia gave you credit for." Behind me, Mason dropped through the grate, landing in a crouch. Calden's eyes flicked to him, and something like fear finally crossed that smooth face. "2 against 1, Mason said softly, dangerously. "Bad odds, Calden." 3 against 1, a voice corrected from above. We all looked up. Standing at another entrance, an actual door I hadn't seen in the shadows, was a woman I recognized from the compound, the one who'd welcomed us to the temple. But her expression wasn't blank anymore. It was furious. "I heard everything," she said, her voice shaking. "You lied to us, all of us. There's no transcendence, no ascension, just this." She gestured at the chest with disgust. "Crimes, evidence, control." Other faces appeared behind her, more cult members drawn by the fire, by the chaos, by the collapse of everything they'd believed. Their expressions ranged from confusion to horror to rage. Calden looked around at the closing circle, and for the first time, I saw genuine panic in his eyes. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "Everything I did was for your evolution, your growth." "You used us," the woman spat. "You used our children." I moved while they were focused on Calden, slipped past Julia, who seemed frozen in shock, and reached Grace. Her skin was cool but not cold. Her pulse steady under my fingers. Alive. Safe now. Finally safe. I gathered her into my arms, cradling her head against my shoulder. She weighed almost nothing. So small. So precious. "Julia," I said quietly. She turned to me, her face a mask of devastation. The blade slipped from her fingers, clattering against stone. "I thought I was saving her," she whispered brokenly. "I thought I was finally doing something important, something that mattered." "You're her mother," I said. "That's what matters. That's all that's ever mattered." She crumpled then, falling to her knees, sobs tearing from her throat. I wanted to feel triumphant, vindicated, but looking at her broken there on the floor, I felt only sadness. Sadness for the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. Mason grabbed the chest, tucking it under his arm. "We need to go, now!" Calden lunged for him, but the other cult members held him back. Their hands were gentle but firm. They'd followed this man, believed in him, and now they were taking him apart with their disillusionment. We left through the door the woman had opened, climbing stairs that led up and out. Behind us, I heard Calden screaming, heard sirens in the distance. The fire had drawn attention. Help was coming. We emerged into the forest beyond the compound. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Grace stirred in my arms, her eyelids fluttering. "Grandma?" she murmured, confused and drowsy. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe. You're safe now." She believed me, curled closer and went back to sleep. In the distance, the compound burned, and somewhere in that chaos, an empire of lies was finally collapsing. We burst out of that doorway and onto the forest floor. The air was cold. It was crisp. What a stark contrast to the cloying smell of incense and fear we just left. It smelled of pine needles and damp earth. A welcome scent, I tell you. The sirens were much closer now, slicing sharply through the trees. They're coming for the fire, I thought. They're coming because of the commotion. And maybe, just maybe, they were coming for the truth. I held my granddaughter tight against my chest. Her weight, usually so light, felt like the heaviest, most precious cargo in the world. I focused on the steady pulse I could feel at the base of her small neck. That stable, simple beat was the only proof I needed that I had succeeded. My heart was still hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. I tried to regulate my breathing. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. An old nurse's habit. It had saved lives, and it saved me in that moment. Mason walked beside me, his steps quick and purposeful. He held the wooden chest tucked tight under his arm like a rugby ball. Inside that box was the paper evidence. Cold, hard facts. I hadn't destroyed that cult with a gun or with fire. I had brought them down with the truth. With Henry's old maps, with Mason's desperate testimony, and with my own refusal to lose to them. We didn't speak for a long time. The only sounds were our feet crunching over the forest debris, and faintly the distressed shouts from the building far behind us. I made myself not look back, not to see the orange glow peeking above the trees, not to listen to Calden's world crumbling. That chapter was closed. My only concern was the small, warm body in my arms. We reached the old service road where Mason had left his battered pickup truck. It was a deep gray, blending perfectly with the weak light of the breaking dawn. He wordlessly opened the passenger door for me. I settled inside, carefully resting Grace on my lap, her head leaning on my shoulder. She was still in a deep, medicated sleep, exhausted from everything they had put her through. Mason climbed in and turned the key. The engine coughed once, then sputtered roughly to life. The sound was surprisingly loud in the quiet forest. Just as we were about to pull away, I glanced at Mason. In the faint morning light, he looked younger, yet hollow, like a statue weathered by years of regret. Did you get what you needed?" I asked him quietly. I kept my voice low so as not to wake my granddaughter. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the muddy track ahead. He replied with a dull, empty voice, devoid of the anger and desperation I'd heard before. The whole ledger, every name, every transaction. He had his revenge. I realized then, his justice was cold and documented, while mine was warm and sleeping on my knee. I didn't care about the names or the money. I just wanted my granddaughter back. We drove for miles in silence. The forest began to thin, and soon the familiar rolling hills of Snoqualmie appeared. The sky was a clear, pale blue now, a color that promised a beautiful, ordinary day. It felt surreal. The world was still turning. People were waking up, brewing coffee, checking the news. And they had no idea about the war that had just ended a few miles away. Finally, the tension in my shoulders began to ease. I felt every ache, every cut, every bruise I had acquired in the last 48 hours. My fingers were stiff, and my knees screamed. I was 68 years old, and I had just played the part of an untrained warrior, fueled only by grandmotherly rage. "You need to get some rest," my voice came out raw. I offered him the simple, essential advice of a nurse. "Find somewhere safe, get cleaned up, and call the authorities." He gripped the steering wheel tighter. He spoke with a sigh that carried the weight of a lifetime of bad choices. "I will. I have to." I knew he would. He had stepped across his own moral line, and now the hard work of living with the consequences remained. My consequences were waiting for me at home. A quiet house, a waiting coffee maker, and the deep, terrifying void left where Julia used to be. We reached the edge of town, startled by the sudden switch. A yellow school bus zipped past. A man was walking his dog. Normalcy, vibrant and loud, was back. I asked Mason to drop me off a few blocks from my house. I didn't want his truck or that box visible near my driveway. The fewer connections, the better. He pulled over beneath a large maple tree whose leaves were already turning a fierce, burning orange. "Thank you, Mason," I said, meeting his eyes. I spoke to him with genuine gratitude. "You saved us, too." He muttered an almost inaudible agreement. "Just keep the kids safe, Eleanor." "I will," I promised. I already was. I carefully lifted my granddaughter. She was like a warm, small oven against the chill of the morning air. I closed the truck door and watched Mason's truck disappear down the street. Then I turned and started walking toward my house. The walk was the longest part of the journey. Each step was a deliberate act of will. I walked with the steady pace of someone finishing a marathon. The front door was locked just as I had left it. I used my key, and the click of the tumblers sounded incredibly loud. Inside, it was cool and quiet, and surprisingly, profoundly normal. The faint scent of Henry's pipe tobacco still lingered in the den, like a ghost of comfort. I carried my granddaughter straight to her room. I pulled back the bed covers and gently laid her down on the crisp, clean sheets. She sighed, burrowed into the pillow, and didn't stir. I stood there for a long time, just watching her breathe. Sunlight now streamed through the window, striping her face. I spoke to her in that quiet room with a voice full of prayer. I whispered a promise heavier than any vow. "It's over, baby. You're home." And then I went to the kitchen. I put water on the kettle. When it finally whistled, it was a sound of deep triumph. I made my coffee, poured a cup, and finally settled into the old armchair by the window. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the mug soak into my chilled hands. It was finished, but the image of Julia's face, that look of shattered devotion, came back to me. I reflected with a deep, sorrowful ache. She had lost everything: her faith, her daughter, her freedom. She thought that cult offered a grander purpose than motherhood, and I realized that was the heart of her desperation, that human desire to be more than what you are. I finally opened my eyes. The morning was beautiful, and I was just Eleanor, a grandmother who had done what needed to be done. No grand titles, no spiritual ascension, just love, hard-won and enduring. The coffee was bitter, but perfect. I raised the mug slightly, a silent toast to the quiet strength that had carried me through, the quiet strength of just getting up and making coffee. And I knew we would be okay. We were safe, and that was everything.